Good afternoon. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the interim director of the Wolfe Institute. Thank you all for being here today for what promises to be a really exciting, interesting, and urgent conversation. Over the last years, the increased social and legal visibility of trans lives has been met with social and legal backlash that has been swift and violent, and it's a backlash that aims to erase these lives. It is with a sense of urgency then that we are here today to engage with the important work of two excellent scholars, B Lee-Harrison Aultman and Paisley Curra. Professor Aultman will be sharing with us selections from their forthcoming book, The Transordinary, and Professor Curra will then respond to the presentation. We will be sure to reserve some time at the end for questions and comments from the audience. Now, 2 points. First, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the LGBTQ+ Resource Center and the Women's Center at Brooklyn College, the Political Science Department and the Philosophy Department at Brooklyn College, the Women's and Gender Studies Program at Brooklyn College, and CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. This is important work, and it is good when our partners recognize it as such, so thank you. I also want to announce that tomorrow, November 17th, the LGBTQ+ Resource Center at Brooklyn College is hosting a Trans Day of Remembrance Vigil. It is at 12:30 p.m. People should meet at the steps of Boylan Hall with a procession to the Lily Pond. Now, it is a time to remember the lives of trans and gender diverse folk who have died due to transphobic violence. The guest speaker for that event is Elisa Crespo. Elisa served as the education liaison for the Bronx Borough President's Office and then made history by becoming the first transgender woman of color to run for public office in the Bronx. Currently, Elisa is the executive director of the New Pride Agenda. So please join them tomorrow at 12:30 in front of Boylan Hall. And with that, let me thank each of you for being here today and to our speakers for agreeing to share their work, their smarts, their expertise with us. I'm going to introduce them and then turn it over to them. B Lee-Harrison Aultman is a political theorist, educator, and trans activist. They received their doctorate from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and has been teaching at CUNY since 2008. Their research is situated where the borders of trans studies, critical theory, and Black feminist thought converge. B's current book manuscript, The Transordinary, is under contract with SUNY Press, and we'll be hearing about it in a couple of minutes. Their work has appeared in various peer-reviewed journals, such as TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Ouagadougou, a journal of transnational women and gender studies, and Writing from Below. They've also contributed to peer-reviewed chapters to the LGBTQ Studies, A Critical Reader, the Oxford Encyclopedia of LGBTQ Politics and Policy, and the Sage Encyclopedia of Trans Studies. Their forthcoming research on trans masculinity will appear in the Routledge Handbook of Men, Masculinities, and Organizations, Theories, Practices, and Futures of Organizing. And they've also are quite excited about contributing a chapter to the anthology of Futures of Cartoons Past, The Cultural Politics of X-Men, the animated series. Now, Paisley Curra is a professor of political science, where he is my colleague, and of women and gender studies at Brooklyn College, and of the Graduate Center of the City of New York. Curra has written widely on transgender issues, including on topics such as discrimination and sex reclassification and the transgender rights movement. He's the author and editor of over 30 articles and books, and the co-founder of the leading journal in transgender studies, TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. Curra's newest book is Sex is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity. This project compares the transgender rights, his next project will compare the transgender rights movement with the women's movement. Curra has advocated for transgender rights at all levels of government. He was a founding board member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, served on the founding board of directors of the Global Action for Trans Equality, and sat on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch LGBTQ program. I am incredibly excited and grateful for them for being here today and sharing and giving us the opportunity to learn from them. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Aultman.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to do something that I typically don't, which is to read directly from things that I've written down to keep some sense of organization. I tend to sort of one hand wing it. But here I felt like
heavy. What size is this?
it was probably best for me to take not only selections from the book, but selections from the preface and the introduction, and then bring them together as hopefully what remains to be about 10 to 15 minutes, and then open it up to Paisley to respond, and then hopefully have a conversation. So, you know, in my tradition of throwing a curveball, I'm going to be reading from both the preface and the introduction, Paisley. So there's perhaps some new information just to make sure we keep you on your toes. So the Transordinary, the title of this book, is built on a fuzzy archive. Fuzzy because the texts, images, and documentary examples range in content, disturbed normalized context, and vary across many different forms of life writing and representations of being trans. It is filled with examples of fugitive experiences that drive home an important fact. Transness is not a monolith. We could define trans here as a matter of two distinctly opposed binary properties in an intimate relation, the outcome of which determines whether one might be cis or trans, which is itself a binary. On the one hand is the sex that one is assigned at birth. On the other is the gender identity that one possesses that does not define or identify with their sex assigned at birth. Trans implies, or has implied, therefore, a crossing from one point, sex, to another point, gender identity, or some interplay of both. What this definition produces is an identity, indeed, and it redescribes a range of experiences and perhaps subjectivities. It is there for the purposes of producing self-knowledge, but I tend to avoid deploying this definition in the book. There is an underlying connection between this idea of trans, as has been defined here, and what I do describe as transness. That's to say, the connection of embodiment in various practices. My sense of transness, however, is that it is not reducible to gender-affirming care or social transitions or any of the many ways that bureaucratic changes to such activities might entail. The provisional idea is that transness emerges within its own social field defined by relational practices, that these practices condition the lived experiences and consists of narrative elements that trans subjects will share as their stories of self-creation. But, and this is crucial, they do so in these relational ways that illustrate the singularity of their life. Trans is a descriptive resource and a powerful one, but I don't endorse the argument that it should be classified solely as a form of identity, especially in the liberal tradition of political theory, which is, of course, my own discipline. To meet that standard, a subject's identity has to be self-same, autonomous, and emanate through acts that reflect an unimpeded will. And I am aware of the many interventions that have been made since John Locke and that theory of the subject up till now. But there is an accepted premise of continuity across consciousness, conscience, and action that seems to privilege cis over trans, or to impose a certain way of being on trans. The simple fact remains that really no subject can define themselves as a part of those terms. No person I have ever met, in fact, has experienced a continuous line of correspondence so luminous that it produces a self that is confident in the face of all kinds of misrecognition. The fact is, discontinuity happens. And transness should not be necessarily defined by discontinuity, and not because it imposes an impossible or pathological spin on the experience. Transness should not be defined by discontinuity because it describes life experiences along continuous and discontinuous modes of memory, consciousness, conscience, agency, and any number of other terms that canonical political theory and other forms of feminist theories use to redescribe human life. It's why I turn to the concept developed across many kinds of discipline, including philosophy and the philosophy of science, forms of life. The term form being used here to describe how a thing becomes intelligible not only to others, but to itself, and that it can index the historical, ethical, and political reasons for these kinds of emergence. I use the term, for example, forms of trans life in many instances to describe the range in which transness takes shape. My provisional idea operates under the assumption that transness is a generalized field of play, that it has elastic rules, that gender non-normative people engage in mediating these rules through interaction, through different forms of play, through stretching these rules, that my transness is not another trans person's sense of transness, and that's fine. And that the narratives I examine in this book move across many different kinds of mediated, nevertheless, forms of gender non-normativity. Therefore, transness can include non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, transgender, transsexual, and transvestite forms of life. And this I draw from a very mixed and, as I mentioned, fuzzy archive, but it doesn't end there. If not already having been contaminated by certain kind of Western settler colonial understanding of gender, it would also embrace non-Western modes of, say, gender expression that would otherwise have been failed or would fail to consider, such as Indigenous American Two-Spirit people, the Abanji or the Nigerian Abanji, the Indian Hijra, the Brazilian travesti, or the multiplicity of other forms of life that necessarily do not meet the script of being trans in the typical American sense of some sex and gender discontinuity. It is likewise a mistake to classify any of those above as being or participating in the construction of a third gender, as if their presence could only be made intelligible by violently decontextualizing their life worlds. With so much at stake, I hope readers, but really members of the audience, can be aware of my unstated decision to foreground transness before attempting to answer the question, which is, I'm sure, on what's everyone's mind: what exactly do I mean by the transordinary? Many brilliant works of scholarship in trans studies have established firm points of reference when we narrate trans life, and that most tend to reproduce the problems of abjection. That means studies of trans life are most critical, quote, which is shorthand for better and more accurate often, when it determines how life-making practices conduce to a state of living on or making do in the face of violence. I made every effort to avoid this certain kind of attachment. Although I agree with these scholars who deploy the terms of practice by emphasizing the need to track power and the structural patterns of violence that impinge on trans life routinely, I believe that our present is pervasive, or indeed our present is pervasive with biopolitics and is complicit with the uneven, with the uneven distributions of life chances that depend upon a population and regulatory controls that make, die, or let live according to various kinds of differences, not least of which is racialized, but that a trans subject's life world is not necessarily saturated and therefore laminated by this biopower. Their endurance is not an index of transphobia's effects. And to discover what a trans person is surviving requires us to pay attention to what is being mediated, to what is really being lived, to how it is they narrate their life. So this book is written with an attendant focus on life's infrastructures. Infrastructures in this sense are everywhere in the trans ordinary. And that stress, however much is very real, infrastructures participate in the amelioration, the engagement, and the dismantling of those sources. But they are not indicators of what it is, or perhaps even what it means to simply or merely carry on. If one were to use the term critically, carrying on implies the activity of surviving, and in my sense, really, surviving what it takes to survive. That locating joy in the same place as one is expected to find terror. That one might actually discover that pleasure is not an exclusive aspect to those whose privilege allows enough distance to make refined distinctions. But that if being critical, if we link all forms of survival to one central mode, this laminating structural power would require us to ontologize being trans and being cis and undo the entire project of the ordinary altogether. So I hope by now you could see why it would be difficult, or why I found it difficult, to define the trans ordinary, because it's deceptively simple. Right? Frustrating in that sense, because it always seems just beyond my immediate reach. The ordinary is common, even base. It's something that everybody seems to know. The ordinary can speak for itself. The ordinary can go without saying. It remains unspoken when most of us, if not all, complain about being bored. And for our part, we have allowed this sense of the ordinary to solidify into common sense. But this takes for granted the incredible depth and scope of practices that produce our relation to ordinary life. In fact, common sense could be that same structure that laminates practices of such depth and denies their mobility. And as I mentioned before, this is usually what I mean by structure, those things that laminate, put into place, understand, in fact, saturate life with stress, underprivilege, or overprivilege, biopolitics. A recurring argument in my book will be how life infrastructures are produced by trans subjects so that they can connect their life to the world in habitable ways. And this is what I mean by the trans ordinary. It is the non-place in which that proximity exists between a habitable life and a world. A lot of what I will be speaking about, or I should say, those references I make in the book, will be to the aesthetics of object scenes, attachments to objects that co-produce scenes of optimism for the world, that object scenes construed in such a way to make the life or to make the world itself and a life livable or bearable, and that they do so on the basis of relationality. My archive is a mixture of narratives from personal sources to institutional ones, and each represents various styles of living, certain relations to transness that may or may not be shared from one narrative to the next, in a way of approaching them offers a means of thinking about what relates each one to one another. Hence, we are confronted at once with varieties of practices that redescribe what it means to make do, what it means to keep a life together, but also how it is that there are different and varying genres of emotional engagement that open up to new conventionalities, new modes of gender non-normativity, different ways of being, all of which come back, all of which, again, come back to how it is a particular life, just to say how it is a particular trans subject relates their life to a world that seems to have disavowed or disowned them. Forgive me, I'm still incredibly nervous. First book. So let me review a few critical themes so far. First, transness is relational. Trans subjects actively shape the object scenes that anchor meaning to a life, not least of which can mean styles of inhabiting gender and sex variably. Moreover, personal infrastructures or life infrastructures enable new social ties. They can repair others and can reproduce available ones. They suture a trans life to the world, and that this suturing occurs at the expense or the construction of different kinds of attachment. That's to say, life-making practices carry differing intensities. I use the term affect to describe those intensities, and that these infrastructures can modulate how affect circulates, and that the transordinary, that space of proximity between a life and a habitable world, temporizes affect, can slow down the feelings of not belonging, can ensure that the sense of being divested of feeling is put at bay. And that it might seem obvious then that being trans or to live at the margins of the social order at all entails learning how to live with good and bad affect. But it means learning how to live with good and bad affect in the same moment and at the same time. It also means learning to survive while also retaining those attachments to life. That we learn to live with a variety of ways of surviving that can feel anxiously urgent. That trans people have learned that threat is always and seems forever in the background. This is what I tend to evoke by the term non-event. The presence of something known to have happened in the past, yet its effects are always traced like residues into our present, and sometimes even into our abilities to think about the future. To repeat, the non-place of the transordinary becomes the imaginary geography for this non-event. We make things habitable. Throughout the book, I will be appealing through or to new infrastructures that share the work of developing our critical imagination, transitional infrastructures, transformative infrastructures, reparative ones, and even dissociative ones. That the possible, which is imminent to potentiality, implies much more than just good luck. There's an ethics to it, that the proximity of our life and to the world is not determined, or at least not predetermined, to be structurally condemned as trans people. That negative assessments, according to some in critical theory, tend to prohibit breakthroughs. Right? Perhaps it's a fear of being optimistic. And perhaps it's an anxiety that somehow we are inadvertently abetting relations of power. But I don't think that rethinking causality by inviting alternatives to well-worn theories that posit a relation of domination, where rethinking this relation of domination as just a relation of power. Why did I say that? Sorry. I think that I believe that rethinking causality doesn't impoverish our critical imagination. In fact, what I am asking is that readers or members of the audience reconsider what subtle forms of joy and happiness and pleasure remain coextensive and might actually be commingled with pain. And that even if we nevertheless oftentimes reject them out of hand by certain structural or social theories that ontologize violence, we need to learn that sometimes pain and joy exist in the same place. Right. I want to close with an idea, but also, strangely enough, a stanza from the 20th century poet Rilke, who was rather obsessed with object scenes and the idea that objects comprise us. That we do indeed make up object scenes that inscribe our lives with significance, and that Rilke believed that our unwillingness to loosen our attachments has, at least in part, obscured the potential of living freely. And this is taken from the last stanza of his 8th elegy. And we, always spectators, everywhere turn toward the world of objects, never outward. It fills us. We arrange it, it breaks down. We rearrange it, then break ourselves down. But Rilke failed to consider how these breakages induce a relation of surviving a world that has already disowned us. That attachments induce our return to what seems constitutively broken, do not solidify our position or their position in the world. In fact, new imaginaries can erupt from, in fact, inspire, even hint at the murmuring of new worlds on the other side of this brokenness. Survival feels, at least to me, less like an art, as Hill Malatino has suggested in his book on side affects, calling it the trans art of survival. Because the knowledge it sponsors fails to uncover precisely what it is we're surviving. It doesn't teach us how to remain undefeated while we persist with this failure to know. And in fact, it is what, in part, I dedicate this book to, for those who remain undefeated by survival, for those who hold out for a new relation and a new world, and one that is ripe with promise. That's it. Thank you.
Mr. Curran?
Okay, well, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, let me just say I've known B for a while, and it is always a pleasure, but also a little intimidating being in the same academic space as B, because they're like 10 times smarter than I am, and then they'll start talking about Heidegger and stuff, and they're really left behind. Because in some sense we're both political theorists, in another sense B is like a true political theorist, and it feels very comfortable with a lot of the highfalutin philosophy that kind of not good at. So my reading of B is sort of based on who I am. So it's maybe takes it down a peg. But anyways, let me just talk about why I think B's work is so transformative and so important. As someone who's been doing trans studies for a while, I can see there are some kind of ways, there are certain kind of tropes or themes or narratives that always get deployed, and they get deployed so often that people forget that they're just partial themes or partial narratives, and they become like the truth of trans experience or trans existence. So I think what B's work does a great job of kind of breaking that down. And let me just go through some of them. of course, one thing that B's work does is to kind of take issue with any sort of binary, but I'm organized my remarks as binary as like this versus that. So I'm doing binary, but you'll see. So okay, I guess for one thing, we have the kind of heroes, we have the victims and heroes of the trans community or the trans rights movement. So we have these narratives about the people who were killed or abject victims, or we have these narratives of the people who kind of like fought and overcome adversity. And those narratives are strategic and important, but they also kind of partake of American ways of thinking about people, which is to kind of elevate the individual. So it's this person overcame adversity, or maybe this person didn't, but it's always about the individual. And so one of the things that B's work does a really good job of doing is to kind of talk about how we're always in community with each other all the time, directly or through what we might talk about in terms of infrastructure, but the focus on relationality has dropped out of the picture. So there's in much contemporary trans studies and trans rights advocacy, because we've accidentally kind of fallen into these typical American ideas of like celebrating in the individual. Another important intervention B's work makes is to kind of move beyond the event and to talk about life as ongoing. And I mean, that kind of seems kind of simple, but like when you think about how trans things are represented, like this thing happened, that thing happened, Republicans passed a law, this person was denied healthcare. Those are all bad things, but they get kind of framed as like containable events. And what B's work asks to think about is to think about these events as actually just ongoing, situations. I think now we're all talking about decolonizing everything. There's that kind of now sort of famous for academics anyways, I think it's not famous for everybody. There's that quote by, I think the guy's name is Alan Wolfe, where like colonialism is a structure, not an event, So I think what B's work does is kind of like talk about like the structure, or like in particular the infrastructure of trans lives. Another thing that's really important for me is to talk about a lot of trans policy and trans politics are talked about as like exceptional. Like, so right now the focus is on what the Republicans are doing. So we could pull up a map and we'd see all these states with all these bad bills. So I guess those are events, and there still are these exceptional moments of violence, even in a Zoom thing. But I think it's also important to kind of think about like the non-exception, but the quotidian, the mundane, dare I say, the ordinary. So for example, one thing that gets talked about a lot, everybody's against transphobia. I'm against transphobia. It's a terrible thing, right? The Republicans Party is like officially transphobic now. So, then they shouldn't be, and that's bad. But then it kind of gets us to kind of thinking about like the quality of trans lives is like, oh, if you live in a red state, that's a bad thing. But if you live in a blue state, that's fine. But if you actually look at like the morbidity and mortality rates of trans people, like how long they live and the quality of our lives doesn't depend on whether we live in a red state or a blue state. It depends on the kind of ongoing effects of stigma as a health effect. It depends on the lack of healthcare, the lack of employment opportunities. It actually depends on a lot of the things that make a lot of Americans' lives what Laura Berlant would call cruddy, in terms of what slow death. Like, so there's lots of things that make people's lives terrible. And it's not just the passage of an anti-trans sports bill. It's the fact that we don't have a minimum wage that would pay people to not be in poverty. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough support for people's health. So all those kinds of things get washed away in this kind of focus on the exceptional aspects of transphobia. So I think, the kind of work that B is doing is so important. Another example would be, I think, we like the usual suspects in terms of representation of trans issues, which we have, bad laws or definitions and flowcharts and pie charts and this kind of quantitative encompassing of transgender lives, which is important. It's important for policy stuff. And those of you who are trans or non-binary who are here, you know, should go off and do that task force survey and so they can quantify things. But there's all these kind of usual sources of detailing the what's wrong with policies around transgender people. But B's archive, I love how they talk about it. B's archive is fuzzy. I love this word fuzzy. Like there's no hard and fast lines between what counts as a source or what counts as evidence or what counts as knowledge production, as opposed to a lot of other places where like expert discourses require certain forms of data and certain forms of empirical evidence. So I think the fuzziness of the archive is so important. And then because of the archive is like fuzzy, it can bring in what B talks about in terms of like a fugitivity and in terms of ways of resisting power and knowledge that wouldn't land you in front of a congressional hearing testifying about transgender people. So that's so important. So another really important contribution of B is, and we can talk about this more maybe in the Q&A, is this concept of transness. Because there is this concept of trans and transgender where in some sense it kind of operates as a monolith, even though trans is like an incredibly expansive category and it covers anybody who moves away one way or another from the gender they were assigned at birth. Even as it's expansive, it becomes sort of a like a commodity. It becomes something that like circulates without people thinking too much about like what it encompasses. One way of talking about is like trans becomes like domesticated as a category, but transness is more kind of sideways or orthogonal to any sort of settled knowledge and a priori categories. So it's like it's always a kind of a way of thinking about people that is always information, but it's not already formed, it's not settled. The importance of B's work is again like this is in relation to the kind of the ordinary in the archive. It moves away from the abstractions of liberal discourse, which is to take an identity, as B talks about, that is bounded and imagined to exert some kind of intentionality and will to the kind of concrete embodied complexity of what it is to be a human being in community and not be so tightly bounded and to not know what the hell you're doing per se from moment to moment. That's what it is to be human. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, but that kind of gives you, hopefully from my perspective, a little bit of an overview of like what's so important about this work and why it is really groundbreaking, and it's going to force us to think differently about trans lives. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Aultman and Professor Kara, for both of your presentations. I think now we'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience. I'll just ask that people be respectful and somewhat brief so we can take as many people as possible. Thank you so much. So you can either ask the questions in the chat or put your hand up and we will call on you.
Well, I saw as well. So one, Professor Florence, and two, I think from the audience, Mike, you had a question about education representation of what's happening, say how trans is being represented in educational systems, which in the US is scattered, discontinuous, and fragmented at best. But I'll say, Professor Florence, you'd mentioned, I spoke of living with fear as something in the background. As, I'm just looking through the chat, for example. And it, I think, accords, it kind of connects with what Professor Kuro was saying about how I'm attempting to break from the event and into what looks or appears to be a way of living in ordinary time or in the ordinary. Which is to say the trans ordinary runs the risk, just even saying the words, trans ordinary, runs the risk of homogenizing the experience of everyday life, when something that emerges as transphobia always looms on the horizon, can be the one experience one has or multiple experiences one has with transphobia, and can forever contaminate the experience of everyday life. But that it doesn't take away from the possibility of beauty that exists within a similar space. So the ordinary as that which contains within it both the sensation and experience of fear, but that what my work is attempting to do is to delve into what comprises the narrative of that fear, whether it's the combination, and tends to be this, the combination of different elements that takes the transphobic, that takes the, if we're thinking through the capitalist, the fact of not having a job, access to healthcare, whether transition or gender affirming care is available, whether representations of myself, for example, I see on television or streaming on television is accurate, whether family members are living or dying. These are all aspects of what ends up constituting one's experience of the ordinary. That when I look at this, these elements of the fuzzy archive, is to look at the ways that one builds not so much a shield or to surviving these things, but to look at the ways that this survival that we speak of is the experience of having to live through survival altogether. I mean, it's looking at what it takes to survive survival. I think a lot of that is to say that my book is broken into two parts. The first is phenomenological. The last is more bent towards an aesthetic. But there's something about the fact that, in what I call the excerpt to the book that examines autopoetics, I locate my own experience with my mother's slow death and as a result of breast cancer, the multiple times and diagnoses, whether she was moving through remission or not. And this was published in the form of the self-titled excerpt, or the Politics of Memory, in the Journal of Narrative Politics, at least a form of it, to examine the ways that there's this sense of time shift that happened for me in looking at how my relationship to the possibility and presence of life was always shaped by something like the threat of death, and that it didn't create the space of ongoing depression and sadness, but it also didn't create over sentimentality. It created a space of experiencing the affect of joy and happiness in the presence of things that could immediately take it away, that get missed in these overarching theories of either the event or the structural pattern, which is why my turn towards the infrastructural is to look at how we build certain ways to either return to the scene that made us happy, to transition through that scene, but also to create, and Shay, you hit the nail on the head, to think about what it is that is so nuanced about trans life that incorporates joy into those scenes.
Hey, B.
So there is just something about that sense that what our lives consist of is more than the ways that power has tended to laminate. What I use is, I love that term for some strange reason, to laminate the way that we end up relating to life and world. And I do treat life and world as being separate. And then to come back to how education, that is a bundle of things, but I wouldn't even begin to, think that there is an adequate way to address the question, but to say that trans folks, in the excerpt, I kind of frame it that trans kids, really queer trans kids, are thrown into a world without a user manual that normative kids seem to always have access to. And so we're having to sort of learn as we go. I mean, that could describe a lot of folks, but learning as we go, as we are confronted with narratives about what we're supposed to be doing with our bodies and how our bodies are supposed to be doing this, when our experience is quite opposite. It throws a wrench in that machine very fast.
There is both. Let's go to Rose's. Rose has the hand up, and then there's a couple of comments on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of showed up late, so I might have missed part of this, but I was just wondering if you had any comment on how you feel that what a good way to bring the idea of the ordinary trans life into the world could be, because I think a lot of times it gets often highlighted the bad experiences that people go through or the discrimination, rather than the lives that everyone has. How do you think that we can bring that to the forefront in a lot of different ways? Because I mean, I'm personal experience, I'm trans, I have a 3-year-old child, I do normal life things, and I feel like the only thing that ever gets talked about is what if something bad happens? What if something horrible happens? What if you're discriminated against? And they just ignore the whole aspect of my life except for those parts. So what do you suggest that people do to bring that ordinary out to the world?
So, I mean, my biggest suggestion seems to follow some of the very tenets that have already been stated, say, by Laverne Cox, right? It's like in every interview, which is to say the reality of lives are never and can never be summed up by focused, whether it's a focus on transition or a focus on violence, but rather asking what it is and how it is we're doing. An interest in, precisely those things that make us, make up a life. And the practices that we engage in that create a habitable zone. By that, to say that, I am kind of making a certain kind of structural, what's the word I would be looking for? Making room for some structural argument there by suggesting that the world has already, and to some extent, disowned or created a space of disowning us. But to say that we are in the creation of our own life in between to suture that life to the world in a way that is habitable. And that when we talk about ourselves and others, when we are in relation to each other, always, I believe that we are always in relation, that there are countless stories that we can read about ourselves and our forebears, those who are presently with us, that speak to practices that are strikingly ordinary, but deserve that attention, that have been submerged beneath the event of violence. Telling our stories. In that sense, I mention, or I perhaps failed to mention in part of the preface, I make it a point of saying that, I love etymology. I love the history of words, right? The ordinary and the like, where I start to think of, well, the term relationality and the term relation come from the root words that mean to tell a story. And it means a commitment to reading and then retelling the stories about ourselves and each other. that are already being formed in community, or I should say in communion, it's probably a better term, that focus on the fact of raising children, right? Having a job, yes, facing discrimination, but that each of these are not bookended by violence, but rather, created in a scene of, relating that these varied moments of just being. Right? I don't know if that necessarily answered the question, but it's like we don't tell our stories enough in many ways to examine those modes of regular, ordinary being, for fear maybe of sounding sentimental. I said, screw it in the excerpt. I talk about the fact that my relation to gender in everyday life was inexorably changed by my mother's death and by watching what happened to her body across 20 years. And yet it sounds ironic, right? How is it that, we focus on we can bring in the positive by starting off with something so negative, but I'm saying there's no difference between the two because they're located in one and the same place.
Thank you. Yeah, you kind of answered my question. I get your perspective as well, and like the idea of getting those stories out there, and also just I think the seeing people as the world changes and it becomes a little bit more acceptable for people to exist. And you have to kind of like in a way put yourself out there so it's known who you are, and you don't just blend in, which can be dangerous in some ways, but it will show that there are people out there who have normal lives. And unfortunately, for the longest time, I think people felt they had to hide who they were. So even though these normal lives have existed for so long, no one saw it. So thank you for your explanation.
Thank you for your question. The archive's there. And I don't even mean like the institutional ones, like you go to a university, just the digital archives are replete with moments like these. But thank you.
Kelly has a hand up.
Oh, am I next? Oh gosh. Hi, B. This is so wonderful. First, I'll just say I find and you even said this about your interest in language. You're so poetic and creative and open, yet also very precise with your language and your words all at the same time, which is, I don't know if the word's intimidating for me, but just in awe. And as you were talking, I just was thinking of things like Paris is Burning by Jennifer Livingston kept coming to my mind many times, the scenes from that movie and how I feel like that movie is all about whatever, I'll use a academic term, liminal space, or the space of existence. And even within the context of the structures that are constantly working to, I'll use your word, laminate the people in that culture in New York City at that time, and all the pleasure and joy and beauty that exists there. I also was thinking a lot about Munoz and queer futurity, and I wonder about your thinking around that, because I feel like you're branching off from that to bring us into the present moment always somehow. Like I was also thinking about Buddhism as you were quoting Rilke, and these, the idea of existing within these polarities and finding the beauty in both sides of that. I've been in it, and I'm sure many of us have our own stories and narratives, but my partner was really, really sick about 7 years ago in the emergency room and whatnot. And I look back at that time as a very beautiful time in my life, in our life. It drew us so close together, as scared as we were around that situation, but it's crystallizing those moments. So I know what you mean around life and death issues and how precious they can be and what you can learn. All of that said, I'm also thinking about, I'm sure, because I know you work, you're thinking in race history and class, and just, how does all this sit? I'm sure I'll read your book and find out, but I am curious around like where this sits in terms of day-to-day realities of of being able to have bodies exist and have enough food and a shelter and whatever it is too. I'm curious to read the book and find out how you situate all of that.
Well, first of all, so thank you for, I think that might be the first time I've ever heard that I can be poetic, somewhat discursive, and at the same time exact. I think I usually tend to be overly lyrical. That's my biggest fear. Is like, that was beautiful, but what does it mean? Was like usually my anxiety. But that firstly to say, you know, this book is still probably in terms of being in print, not until late next year. So it's right now been published in sections. So the excerpt, I think a lot of my own, and I'll send out a link for everyone, but a lot of the work has been in the form of articles, like the trans complaint, which is really, you know, I would probably just end up renaming it. Its subtitle is The Contribution to the Disagreement About Desire. And that came up as my take on what happened a few years ago in trans studies with Andrea Long Chu, and you know, her work on females, but also her work in trans studies is over or after trans studies, that kind of thing. But that, you know, when I think about what is, you know, what takes place in the ordinary that is still, you know, we might say cut short and still visited by violence, and how that is intersected with issues where, you know, we're thinking along those lines of race and class inequality, where my work is this book takes into a more critical account, especially in the chapters on infrastructure, which is a larger question about how dissociation and dissociative infrastructure takes place and works through, in a way, meaning making and having meaning in the face of corrosive institutions that almost disallow that meaning to take hold. I'm hoping that I'm not forgetting I wrote your question down, but that it was precisely how is it that we can pay attention to the ordinary in the face of that, and if, you know, because you're gonna have to wait a while to read the whole book, I can say with some authority, I guess, that I want to trace the fact that there are so many literary beyond genres, literary works, and the presence of narratives that push against being totalized as, and being, you know, prefigured as responses to threat, and that these new ways of seeing and thinking about the world aren't just visions, you know, contained to the literary or the poetic imagination, but rather are real ways of seeing a different form of solidarity across different across lines of difference, communities where, if Munoz is taken here into critical reflection, if we're thinking about the future, we're thinking about what it means to hold space for the future. It means holding out space that doesn't flatten difference, and that doesn't celebrate difference in a way that makes it into a site of appropriation, but also holds, within that space is one of conversation, which we've, I think, forgotten. The genre of conversation is supposed to be the suspension of an end, where we hold out the possibility that we just continuously make use of that time that we have with each other, that the end of, perhaps the biggest problem with a dialogue or even the dialectic is that it's supposed to produce something. The expectation of that production sometimes cuts short the possibility of new imagination. And I think that Munoz's work, which does influence a lot of reflective material in the book, is to think through how it is that we have managed to get through the things that should be, by all accounts, have withered us away. We're here in this digital space, here in a world still writing, and still making of ourselves narratives of more than just survival. And that, it is something that is not just surviving. It is something about, we have yet to even, I think, collectively, in terms of scholarship, understand what precisely it is we're surviving. If we say we as trans communities in plural, like what we're surviving is so disparate and cross-pollinating. I hope that answered, at least in part, the question.
Yeah, can I just say one other thing is, in the discussions in the center with students here and around trans identity, I've recently had a couple of conversations around sort of like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, in terms of notions around passing or not, or gender non-conforming, or somewhere in between, and sort of like the structures that want to laminate. I saw this horrible Megyn Kelly video about like detransitioning, this shit.
Yeah.
Frankly, it's sort of like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so that's sort of what I was thinking about too, as you were speaking, like, we don't even need to worry about that. Like, we're already doing some, that's what I got from what you're saying. Like, we're doing something else. Why do we even need to worry about whether or not they are going to use whatever it is we're going through to slam us down? Like, look, they don't know, they're confused, kind of thing. Like, whatever, let's just go be on our stage and our kind of future utopian now. Let's just go make our stages and be there, make our stories heard to ourselves. And, as we've been doing, I almost don't feel like it's a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you for that. I agree.
That's good. Professor Florence has a question in the chat, and then we'll go to the hand that's up. Professor Florence writes, how does the fluidity in identity link to Du Bois's double consciousness?
So I think that in the sense, there is going to be the fact that in the trans ordinary, the way that I'm describing it is that, it would probably be more accurate to say trans ordinaries, maybe the plural, the multiple, and to take into account this Du Boisian double consciousness is to take how life is, and in different ways. I mean, in Black studies, thinking through, I think Marquise Bay recently, and Cameron Awkward Rich, talking about the idea of mal-adaption rather than just adapting, to suggest that there is an understanding of how it is the world is perceiving us versus how it is that we also perceive that perception, and that how we perceive our world. And that it kind of ties back into, Kelly, what was just recently, what have been mentioned is, the things that we're ending up doing, which are so multiple and so, and dare I say that word diverse, but plural, that in tying our lives into a habitable space with a world that seems to have disavowed us, if the hope can still be there, which Munoz believed, the hope is still there that the world will then be altered by the fact that we are continuing to make life, that our narratives will populate and repopulate, that I think double consciousness plays its part in how the narratives of so many communities of color are then entering into the archive, really the trans archive, and offering a way of understanding what is singular about that life, right? Shared across many, but singular about how a person's persistence, how a person's persistence has to be understood in the relation they are making, in the sort of particularities of their contexts. You know, I think a lot of what my own work is attempting to do is to say, you know, I've got to unpack so much of what's already layered and layered and layered on top of so many different ways of being, just to get to the point where I can say, okay, this is what a person's sense of transness is, without at the same time taking away all of the important elements that are so deeply contextual that have also made up that transness, whether it's a certain relation to race and racial difference, ethnicity, ability, political time or historical time, and how each of these play a part, which is early in the book, the phenomenology of it, of how it is that people understand their context, right? Their life, their trajectory. And my approach to this is what I call a close but dissociative reading. That's my reading protocol. Close but dissociative. Picks up on all the way, staying close to the narrative, but understanding how and when each part does dissociate, right? Where I also am aware of what that dissociation is doing.
And Joella Williams, your hand's up.
Hi, yes, I love hearing you speak, B, as always. Hi.
Hi.
What Professor Akura stated while singing B's well-deserved praises kind of really resonated with me, this idea of like transness as something obscure and removed from what society perceives as being trans or transgender. Me and B have spoken about this, but there's something so like trans and queer about Blackness. And I don't know if I have a question perhaps, but I'm interested in like exploring how colonialisms in some ways created and simultaneously destroyed that link and sameness to Blackness and transness. And I just also really love the use of ordinary and like its relationship to like the now and the present. I think there's this like mysticism of transness that the left bolsters as like transness as something ancient, but it's truly not. And I think it's important to state neither is a concept of like being a woman or being a man or what it means, what gender means today, but it's like a fairly new concept that has its roots in colonialism and capitalism. And yeah, I really enjoyed hearing you speak, B.
Thank you. And we have, as I mentioned, this sense of how transness and, for instance, Blackness intersect or not, where Marquise Bay's recent work in system failure is looking into I think there is so much brilliant work coming out of Black trans feminism in this vein of asking the question, well, has Blackness, and I think this is a lot to do with Horton Spiller's investigation, the same, but, you know, is Blackness, and has it ever been invited into the scene or the field of gender at all? Or has it always been a kind of an ungendering, where there's an inherent non-binariness to Blackness and experiences of it? And that has fundamentally altered how it is that I can even talk about, let alone bring into, you know, narratives of being trans, right? Where I suddenly find myself thinking, what kind of violence does any kind of representation doing to what it is a person perceives as their relationship to gender, let alone how gender is itself, you know, exclusive and sometimes exclusionary of the ways that, you know, people's bodies are being experienced, and then how that body's experiences are being expressed back out into the world. A lot of those questions are the, if we say, object of say chapters 2 and 4 in my book, where I'm reflecting either on the archive and tracing the experience of one person in particular, a trans woman named Electra. In 1975, since in chapter 2, I focus on 1 year, sounds odd, but just 1 year in the archive, in which so many different things were happening, and that I came across one book called The Queens, and the photographer George Alpert had this photo essay of trans feminine people, and of all of them, only one didn't have biographical information, and it was the one Black trans femme in the book. It was, "This is Electra," and everyone else had something biographical. Everyone else seemed to have a life that and narrative that went in different directions, and in fact was traceable elsewhere, but Electra was not. Her presence was could be, say, tracked as a result of an interview that George gave later on that year in Drag magazine, in which he was just sort of referencing what Electra had said, which was that her hopes was that the book would provide insight and to help others into understanding what her life was like. And that's it. Suddenly it ends. And in that space, one starts to wonder, or I wonder, how do we do justice in making space and enough room, not only just in an archive, but in the ways that we write about difference, especially where transness is being argued as relational, where critical figures are being removed from the space of relationality. And I find Electra to be a critical figure. And then, later, say in chapter 4, where I talk about a book, it's Dear Centurion, where I think through how transness itself cannot contain the many varieties of embodied expression that, in and outside of Western culture are deeply spiritual, and thereby, kind of defy the way that the typical argument about trans and what that means in terms of, one's relation between sex and gender suddenly gets defied. So that my definition of transness as relationality brings in and is capacious enough to talk about those differences without running the risk of being so open that it becomes meaningless. Right? But that there is this sense of urgency that I feel that where ordinary life is and fails to be borne out in the face of these other overarching and overly descriptive structural, I wouldn't go so far as to say tropes, because they become sort of the key terms, I guess, in social theory. But how do we keep that? How do we keep these worlds alive, these lives in some sense alive, without getting lost in the gloss of social theory?
Fantastic. Any final questions or comments for Professor Kara, Professor Aultman? I want to say a couple of things. First, I want to apologize for the disruptions, but we persist because our stories must be told, our spaces must be claimed, our voices heard, because these are vital conversations. Second thing I want to do is I want to remind everyone of the Trans Day of Remembrance Vigil tomorrow at 12:30, meeting in the steps of Boylan with a procession to the Lily Pond. And the third thing I want to say is I want to thank everyone who engaged in productive and thoughtful ways with the conversation today. Thank you so much for pushing us forward. And then lastly, I want us to assume it's weird because we give the little hand applause, but if I can have people sort of unmute themselves and give Professor Kara and Professor Aultman a round of applause for their engagement with us and for making us sort of, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I want to ask one last thing. If you are joining us today, please make sure to join the Wolfe Institute Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter page. But with that, thank you, everyone. Be safe, be happy, and we persist. Be well. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Rose?
I was just going to say, I don't have social media. Is there any other way to reach out to the institute you just mentioned?
Wolfe Institute at berkeley.cuny.edu.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Be well.
And to my students who are still there, I will reach out shortly.